All right, so we're going to shift gears and bring on our guest speaker from today, Mike Desjardins. So Mike, thanks for joining us. I'll do a quick intro of you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Cameron.
Awesome. So Mike and I have known each other for 25 years, which is pretty scary.
And yet we're so young.
Yeah, exactly right. So Mike Desjardins is the CEO of Virtus. Mike is emotionally intelligent and driven. His core motivation is to make a difference in the lives of others. That is to say, his passion is creating positive change for his colleagues, clients, and community. Mike has his Bachelor of Commerce from UBC's Sauder School of Business, a CPHR designation, and over 2 decades of experience transforming businesses. He's a master in the realm of strategy and leadership development. Mike focuses on strategy, growth, and vision for Virtus. Passionate about leveraging his team, he engages them all in co-creating Virtus's future vision and determining their role in it. Above all, Virtus is his vehicle to empower leaders, both within the company and among our clients. Mike is passionate about skiing, yoga, running, CrossFit, and anything in the self-improvement bucket in his community. His focus on what he can do for others, and he loves nothing more than spending time with his daughter and wife. And Mike is generous to be giving up his time. And by the way, just so you all know, we don't pay any of our speakers at the CO Alliance. These are all high-powered. These are all just great CEOs that are giving back into the community and that are donating their time and their learning. So if you like the stuff that Mike is talking about, you'll be able to engage with him afterwards and get more information, but also just a big thank you to Mike for coming with us today. So Mike, thank you. Go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Thanks so much. So you'll notice I'm going to be sipping on tea, and I've got a Kleenex nearby here, and my voice is shot. I got my voice back late yesterday. Cameron doesn't even know this, but I contracted COVID. And so I've been dealing with that for the past week. And thankfully today, my voice was back enough. I rested it all day yesterday. So anyway, that's what's going on in my world. I am coming to you right now from beautiful Whistler, British Columbia, where there is a very slight temperature difference between Whistler and Scottsdale this morning. I woke up and it was 1 degree Fahrenheit, and it's not really going to climb that much today. So the polar vortex is definitely coming through here. And so Cameron talked a little bit about who I am. I'll talk a little bit just about what my business is so you understand what it is that we do, and it'll set context. I've got the chat window open. And so if, for those of you who are online, Richard, Brandon, Andrew, Tim, Ray, and Ashley, I can see any of your comments you type in, and Meredith or Cameron, if you want to type anything into the chat field, I'll make sure and track that as well. So my company was founded in October of 2000, and we are a certified B Corp. We've got 22 people. We have been a remote workplace, work from home environment since 2009. So back in March, when COVID really hit for us, which was our spring break here in Vancouver, my team, which is spread out across Canada, we were already working from home and had been for 11 years. So I'm here to talk to you about how to build a world-class culture and how to develop leaders. But I can also speak to what it means to build a remote hybrid environment, both from running a company this way, but we've also taught companies for the last 11 years how to do this. 90% of our work is leadership development, and 10% of it is strategic planning. We work with so we do executive team development for CEOs, VPs, leadership development for directors, managers, and high potentials. And then we do, assessments, cohort-based learning, coaching, remote and blended learning. We were using Zoom. I was actually kind of happy when the world figured out what Zoom was, because it'd been so long that we've been using it, trying to convince people to move to it, and nobody knew what it was. So it made a big difference for us that we don't have to convince people that it's possible to do things on Zoom anymore. So we have deep experience in virtual remote learning, in person, and we've worked with every platform you can imagine in developing leaders, from an avatar-based learning solution to all the popular ones, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, whatever, Skype back in the day. And we do work across North America. So our clients are quite spread out. We cover all time zones. And our clients are entrepreneurial high growth organizations, or organizations with 100 million and larger in revenue. Our larger clients probably average around $1 billion in sales. And our average engagement with a client to support them on leadership development is around 7 to 10 years. The longest one right now is about 13 years. And if you were to talk to one of our clients and you ask them about 3 things that are unique about us, they would probably say to you that 1, the programs that we developed felt like they were made for us by us internally, that our clients love working with us. They don't just like working with us. And then we track our NPS. We call it our net promoter, or we don't call it the net promoter score. We call it our likelihood to recommend. And we have averaged 9.12 out of 10 for 4 years. That's the average. And it dropped down when we went completely remote with all clients at the beginning of COVID. It dropped down this year to 8.7, but the average now will then be 9 across the board for 4 years. So we know how to create incredibly engaging programs to develop leaders. So that's enough of the kind of background of who we are. I just wanted to give you some context of where I'm coming from and what my world is. What I can say is we've done this work long enough to have cracked the code to developing leaders and to creating world-class cultures in a really tangible way. And that's what I want to try to share with you today. So very few companies actually come to us and say that they want us to fix their culture. That's not usually the request. They'll come to us and they'll say, hey, we need you to do leadership development. And our response is, okay, so we're allowed to change all the behaviors of all your leaders across your entire organization. Yes, but don't touch our culture. Okay, got it. But we can change all the behaviors of all the key people. Yes. So of course, you can hear that inherently what happens. If you change all the behaviors of all the key leaders, you're going to change the culture in a dramatic way. And so one of my favorite examples is the one I'm giving you is a large restaurant chain across Canada. And that's what the COO said to me: don't touch our culture, it's magic. And I said, I promise I won't, but I'm going to change all the leader behaviors. And so he came back a couple of years later and he said, you've transformed our culture, and we didn't think that was possible. We thought we'd kind of had it nailed, and we never knew what it could become. And that's actually the client that's now going on 13 years with us. So I think in the context of the conversation today, as I mentioned earlier around remote learning, the thing that I think I've been thinking a lot about as I watch, vaccination rates in the US and I watch vaccination rates in Canada and then globally, and then watch the spread of the virus. And I'm really trying to track COVID as it affects work. So, to see, well, are we going to be in hybrid work environments? Are we going to be in remote work environments? Are we going back? So based on what I've seen and having talked to thousands of leaders since last March, I suspect that the best way for us to consider the future of work is to think about it from the perspective of there was before March 2020 and then there was after March 2020. And work is going to be fundamentally different. It's changed. It's gone on long enough. It's going to go on a little bit longer. I think we're probably at least another year and a half of this transition of work. And so I think we'll end up more in either in basically in a hybrid environment. And it requires different skill sets from leaders. Leaders were never trained to develop people. I mean, to Richard's question around onboarding, socialization is one of the key things that's missing for people. I was reading this stat this morning in Harvard that I wanted to share with you, which is 85%. They surveyed 1,500 people, leaders worldwide, and 85% of those surveys said they'd had a general well-being decline since the beginning of COVID. And the biggest contributors to their decline were a 50% decline in mental health, 26% increased work demands, 20% basic physical needs, 20% isolation and lack of connection. So Richard, that speaks to your comment about the challenge of socializing, and 13% home life struggles, 10% disengaged from work, 8% lack of leader support, 8% job security concerns, and then 5% some random stuff they didn't reference. So, but when I read that, it really spoke to me because it made me think, have we prepared leaders for that? Like, are leaders prepared for employees that are going through what I just described you to? And I don't think we have overall as society. And so I think that's really shifting the focus of how we think about leadership development. A little bit later, I'll talk to you about some of the key topics that have actually come up from organizations and leaders that have really shown up since around April of last year that didn't have as much of an emphasis on them that they had prior. So when we think about leadership development, now that we have that sort of as our background context, we need to think about leadership development or developing leaders and culture. We need to think about it from a learning organization perspective. So, you know, some people will say, well, learning is when you go to that formal thing. Like I went to Scottsdale and I went to the Royal Palm and I did my CO Alliance, or I attended online. And so that's my learning. I did my learning this month and that took me X amount of time, right? Or people will say, oh, I've got a formal training session I'm going to go to. So that's my learning. That's one form of learning, right? That's formal learning. But what about mentorship? What about peer-to-peer learning? What about learning from your direct reports? You know, as Steve Jobs said, I love this quote, you don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. You hire smart people so they'll tell you what to do. So our direct reports can be a fantastic source of learning. And really from a learning perspective, we don't learn while we're doing. That's kind of the bit of the myth, is that the more experience you have, the more you learn. Really, it's actually the more reflection you have on your experiences, the more you learn. And that's a really important piece of it. And so, you know, it basically follows that kind of mantra of plan, act, reflect, repeat. And any of you that use the agile methodology from an IT perspective on any of your projects will recognize that kind of a rhythm. So all of these learnings, including formal learning, which could be self-directed learning. You know, I'm sure many of you are avid readers. I know I am. I know a lot of people, obviously everybody in my company is, because that's what we do. And so that's self-directed learning. I can read, I can go watch things on YouTube, I can jump onto online learning platforms. And then there's the more guided learning where you're being coached, or you have a formal program that you're going through with other like-minded learners. So we need to think about it as, how are we as a learning organization promoting learning with our leaders? Not just simply what physical formal learning things are we providing to our leaders on a regular basis. And so when we think about the leaders, we want to think about them in terms of what level they're at, because they need very different things. There are very different skill sets required at different levels of the organization, and their development needs to match that. So when you think about the C-suite and VPs, you know, you want them to be obviously very strategically sound. You want them to think about one company and one goal. And you want them to be a very strong team, along with being model leaders for the rest of the organization. Because the challenge is that as much as you can tell people, this is how we want you to show up as a leader in our organization, I can hear you say that. I can take that in. But then subconsciously, I'm just watching what you do. And that's actually how I'm learning to become a leader, by subconsciously watching what the leaders are doing in the organization. If I'm a director and I want to be a VP, I watch the VPs. And when I see what the VPs are like, if I'm like them, that's going to improve my chance of getting promoted into that role. That's what goes on in my subconscious. So we really need this to come from the top. And so I think about it from, you know, starting right at the CEO. How is the CEO demonstrating values-centric leadership that connects to the values, that speaks to the values on a regular basis? And is the CEO, is she holding the rest of the executive team accountable to living those values? From a director perspective, you know, the director's job in an organization is really to run the business day to day. That's what they're there to do, right? They're there to be the leader of leaders, and they're there to think cross-functionally. One of the biggest challenges we see in developing directors is that they've come up through this manager silo, and they've got a team of people. They're very good in the discipline. So say they're in production or manufacturing or in marketing or in finance, they're very good at that discipline. And when they make it to the director level, the challenge becomes that it no longer serves them to try to solve problems by thinking down into their silo. They have to be thinking, what other functions across the organization need to be engaged and involved in this conversation and are going to be directly affected by the results of the decision that we make? So that's the thing that we need to teach directors, is how do you work cross-functionally with your peers to solve problems? And they haven't really had to do that as a manager as much. So when we get to a manager, managers are managing their function, right? For them, it's about growing capability on their teams and actually learning to be a leader. And this is a very hard transition for leaders. There's a great book written by Marshall Goldsmith, and it's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And the basic premise to it is when you're making that leap from being an expert in something, so you've got a ton of experience in marketing or social media, and all of a sudden you're the manager of that function, how good you are doing that thing is no longer relevant. The only thing that matters now is how good of a team can you build. I remember when a leader called me, and she's a VP of public relations. And she reached out to me, and she was involved in the leadership development program with us. And she said, I'm thinking about doing my MBA. And I said, oh, okay, that's great. Like, why do you want to do your MBA? She's like, well, I feel like that will help support me in going to the next level in my career. And I said, okay, well, I've been in strategic planning conversations with you. I've seen you as a leader show up in leadership development. I've been around you and your team. And I can tell you right now that you're playing like at a very high level. I know a lot of executives, you're playing at a very high level. I'm not sure that's going to give you the boost you're looking for. And she said, well, what do I need to do? And I said, well, I think the best analogy I could give you is that you're thinking about this boat. You're the boat, and you're sitting in the water, and you want to make a better boat. And your MBA is about going to make a better boat. And what I think you need to do is, I think you need to raise the level of the tide, because your boat isn't going to float any higher unless the tide goes up. And the tide is your team. So what I would do is I would put all my focus and attention as an executive on building A stars, like A+ players on my team. And so if you don't have A+ players, and she's like, yeah, I don't actually. I have A's and B's, and I have a couple of C's. I'm like, well, that's where I'd put all my attention and energy if I were you. I'd put it into raising those people's capability up, because that's going to float your boat higher as a result of developing them a lot more. And it's going to give you so much more power in this organization than is you going to do an MBA. I think there'll be a marginal gain from an MBA, and I think there'll be a massive gain from you growing your team. So that's what a manager really needs to think about is, how do I now take the skill set that I have and bring it to my team? Like, how do I make sure that they have this skill to improve in all the areas where I need to see them improve? So with that as a grounding in terms of, what we need to see from the C-suite, from directors, and from managers, and I'm just using those three there can be so many more levels in organizations. We work with there can be crazy numbers of titles and levels, but just to keep it simple, that's basically the level structure I'm using. So what I want to chat about before we dive in further into leadership, in particular leadership for development, is to talk about adult learning, because it's an important piece in the background of being successful in developing leaders. So one, with adult learning, which if you think about from a school perspective, if the teacher at the front of the room has all the information and is like giving it to you, that's called a pedagogy, right? There's a smart person at the front and they're telling you everything. The alternative to that is something called andragogy, which is what adult learning is based on. And that says that, yes, the person at the front of the room has information, but so do the people in the room. And so it is a learning environment that is grounded in theory, but focused on practical behaviors. You need to surround leaders with other leaders who are interested in supporting each other's growth. You need examples and cases that actually come from within your organization, stories of the good, the bad, the ugly, decisions that went well, decisions that didn't go well, so that you can deconstruct those, because people will know the lore and the history behind them. You need to show them a direct connection between how what they're learning can be practically applied in their day-to-day role right away. And so if there's a big leap between what I'm learning and how I'm going to apply it, then we see the adoption rate just tank. And then the last piece of it is that in adult learning is that we are building up core competencies and skills with the goal of having changes in behavior. That those changes in behavior over time will create new habits of how leaders show up. That those habits will adjust and shift their attitude in terms of how they think about being a leader. And finally, that whole process is going to change the culture of your organization. And so it becomes more around, this is just the way we are here, or this is the way we lead here. There is limited success with trying to change somebody's attitude. I don't know if you've ever tried to be in conversation and change somebody's attitude or change their opinion. Like, it's just like, you know, most people just get super grounded in what their beliefs are, and then they kind of retract, right? And I mean, obviously in political discourse, you can definitely see that, but you can see that in every area of life. And so here, instead of trying to change their attitudes or opinions on something, we say to them, try this thing out, and you do it for the next couple of weeks and a month. And then you tell us if it worked, right? Go give it a shot. Have a difficult conversation the way we're describing you to have a difficult conversation, and then come back and tell us, was it actually difficult? Did it go the way that you had imagined in your brain it was going to go? Because most of the time when we prepare for a difficult conversation, what we really do is we play this pretend vignette. I'm going to say this, and then she's going to say this, and then I'm going to say this. No, it might not go that way. I'm going to say, and then that never happens. It never really actually plays out that way, right? And so we get them, you know, ready to practice these behaviors, go do them, and then come back us. And eventually what happens is people come back and say, I have a whole different way of seeing this now. And I couldn't have said to them, here's the whole different way of seeing this. You should just start thinking this way now. That just never works. But if we give them an opportunity to do it a different way, and that way successful for them, and you'll notice I didn't say the right way, I said a different way, then as a result of that, they can practice it and come back and change their own minds. So when we think about doing the actual development within an organization, we want to differentiate between the executive leadership team and team development and leadership development for the rest of the organization. When you think about developing an executive team, there's two things that are actually happening. So one thing you're doing is you're actually developing them as a trusted team, because they have one goal, right? They're not a track team. You know, if you're throwing a javelin and I'm running the sprints and I get a gold and you don't, like, that's not a team, right? I guess arguably you could say the relay teams. Definitely those are teams. That was my sport. But but a football team, basketball team, you know, hockey team, they're definitely a team, right? They either win or they lose, as we saw on Sunday. And so as a result of that, we want executive teams to be thinking that way. One goal, one team. So we have to develop them and their trust as a team. I think Lencioni, I'm not sure, Cameron, if you in CO Alliance, if you use Lencioni's model or not, but it's great in terms of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. That's a wonderful place to start. People, you know, clients come to us and say, oh, you know, we want to do a great team effectiveness assessment. What's the most up-to-date modern thing you have? And I'm like, well, there's some that are really complicated, but if you want the one that works, you're going to use Lencioni because it's easy. Everybody understands it. It's simple to use, and you can make massive progress with it. So you might look at the report and say, well, this is really straightforward. There's only 5 things. And it's like, yeah, but if you do those 5 things really well that come out of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, that team can do almost anything together. So that's for the first part of it. The second part of it is that we need to develop them as how they show up as leaders for the whole organization, and because they're a model for everyone else. And so we're doing those 2 things when we're developing leaders at the executive table. Below the executive table, the focus really is on pure leadership development and less on how they come together as a team. With respect to the directors, as I said earlier, we definitely are getting them to work on any problem or challenge or opportunity we bring into the room in a cross-functional way for them to solve it, because their team isn't in the room and we're getting to work on this stuff and all they have is their peers. So we're promoting that behavior within the development. There's lots of different assessments that we can end up using, but they're always based on what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And then modality-wise, there's e-learning. You can use e-learning to do leadership development in organizations. There's great platforms like Degreed, LinkedIn Learning, Udemy, Coursera, Masterclass. The challenges our clients tell us is that they have very low adoption rates, and it's usually single digit. And the reason that we've seen that is because it's due to what I call the library card effect, which is giving somebody a subscription to an online platform is kind of like giving them a library card and telling them to go pick out a book. You know, you wander into the library and you're looking at all these books and you're like, well, where do I even start? I'm like, no, you can do anything you want. I've given you access to the whole library. And they're like, okay, you know what, I'm super busy, so I'll come back to the library later. And then they just don't. And so we see that pure e-learning just ends up not being as driven. Now, Degreed is a little bit better. I don't know if any of you have seen Degreed, but the way Degreed works is Degreed actually has subscriptions to all the other platforms. So it's got like Udemy and LinkedIn Learning and Coursera and Masterclass are actually all built, they subscribe to it in Degreed. And then what Degreed does is it creates like learning paths. So if you want to get to become a better manager, you put in manager, and then it kind of like leads you down a path that Degreed has created for you. It takes quite a bit more work to kind of set that all up, but it's a bit of a different approach because you're not sort of hanging your hat on one of these different platforms. The other thing that we see is that you are missing the interactions and the relationships that you build when you have live engagement in leadership development. So when people are doing purely self-directed, they're kind of learning on their own, but they don't have a peer. They're kind of bouncing things off. They're less likely to go and take it and practice it because there's really no accountability, right? At the end of the day, did you take the course? At the end, it tracks whether or not you completed it all, but great, so you completed it. Like, I don't know that you can go do anything after that. I'm not sure. I know you've completed it. That's all I know. Then you flip down to something like live learning, where it's either in person or using like Zooms or Microsoft Teams. That's a completely different build and approach to leverage. And live is very different than online. So we have our programs that are built for live delivery, and we have our programs that are built for Zoom delivery, and they're not the same. There's a lot of tools, Zoom, Teams, any type of virtual environment, a lot of tools that we can use that make it super engaging to be in this type of an environment that don't work actually in person. And there's some things obviously we can do in person that we can't do on Zoom. But really the reality is now we're doing everything on Zoom. I suspect we're probably going to be doing it on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. It may be permanently, because what we learned in the last 11 years is if you try to teach a hybrid team, where you have a group of people in a room and a group of people online. Now, this is different because I'm just giving you a speech, because we're in that setting right now. If we try to do leadership development in this setting, it's very challenging. We've not seen or spoken to anyone who's been able to figure out how to do this effectively. So the rule of thumb is either everybody live or everybody on a platform. And what we've learned is that online sessions need to be 20 to 25% shorter, a lot more deliberate breaks, a lot of changes in state and changes in flow. There's music, there's large group interaction, there's breakout rooms, there's polls, there's whiteboard, there's chat. It's a lot about the experience. So think it needs to be even more than live. It needs to be edutainment. There needs to be a really high level of engagement. Otherwise, it's really easy for people to kind of just nod off and stop paying attention. And so we're tracking all of our scores to see the difference. There is a slight, as I mentioned, 0.3 for us. We noticed a 0.3 out of 10 difference. So 9 down to 8.7 9.12 down to 8.7. So 0.42 drop in the likelihood to recommend when we went fully virtual. Having said that, these are 90% of those participants had never been learning in a virtual environment. So I suspect those scores are going to continue to climb, which was what we've seen coming into January. The numbers are starting to go back up. There was the beginning was, and I don't know how much was affected by just the general stress of COVID as well, right? And the fact that people had their kids home and their lives were turned upside down. They couldn't see their family and friends, that sort of thing. So you've got e-learning, you've got live learning, and then there's this third thing you can do, which is something we specialize in outside of live, which is blended learning. And what blended learning is, it's kind of like the best of both worlds. And so what you do is you take the benefits of e-learning, where you have the solo learning, it's repeatable, it's shareable, it's trackable. You have that piece of it. And then you add on the live component, which is coaching the practical abilities and the ability or behaviors and the ability for peers to actually interact on their learning. So the cool thing about that is that, so imagine a 4-hour session, right? You're in live learning on Zoom. So a big portion of that's going to be the facilitator on PowerPoint, walking you through the models, explaining you the terminology, walking you through the cases. What if you could do all of that in e-learning in advance? So if you could do that, then we can cut down the in-class session by half. So now we can do it in about 2 hours. And so same outcome. And the amount of time that the individual needs is going to be about 35 to 40 minutes on the e-learning platform. So that blended learning approach really has the best of both worlds. Now, I'm saying that from a perspective of overarching leadership development. We don't use it as much in executive team development. There is a use case for it, but because executive team development is so much about iterative team development along with their leadership development, then there is a less of a likelihood to use that platform in that. But for the rest of leadership development, blended learning is a fantastic way to go. So we have one client right now, which is North America-wide energy company. I can't say the brand, but we are looking at building out for 5,000 leaders. We're building out a blended learning solution, because what they have seen in the past is that they had 3% adoption of their e-learning platform. And their live courses, they've had really high adoption. But the problem is, you take 5,000 leaders and you multiply it, you do the math on the cost, it was going to be, I forget, it was like $4 million. And then like, we're not spending that on 5,000. Like, we're just not going to do that. So I'm like, okay, well, let's come up with a blended learning solution that would enable us to have all the benefits of the live session and all the benefits and cost reduction of using this blended learning approach with having the e-learning attached. And so that's what we're rolling out to them. So the challenging part of it, of course, is that 2 hours has to be really crisp. It has to be very practical, and people have got to be highly engaged in that conversation, and they have to have done the piece online. If they haven't done the e-learning in advance, then they can't attend the course. The date doesn't even pop up for them to attend until they complete the whole thing, because otherwise they'll be completely lost in the session. We're not going through anything. We're going to go straight into the practical applications. And then I think the other piece of it is the difference between considering, should we just grab something that's off the shelf? So, there's a lot of companies that say, well, we have the perfect leadership thing. You should just buy our package A, B, or C, or should we do it customized? And I think that, there's a compromise, and I don't think you need to compromise on budget or compromise on outcomes. I think you can do both, right? I think that the way you can do that is instead of having a company that comes to you and says, hey, we want to customize this whole thing from scratch, because I can tell you it's really expensive. To give you an idea, for us to create a 3-hour course on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, it will take us 120 hours of development. And so it just gets really pricey for us to do a straight custom. The other opportunity is to say, well, what if instead what we did is we customized all the cases and the examples, but we use content that we already have. Give me 1 second. Excuse me. We use cases and examples from within the company, but we use content that we already have. And so that's kind of the best of both worlds. And you know that you're focusing on core principles that are universal, practical, transferable, but they're hearing about things that have happened in your company. They know from the next level, hey, I heard this story that actually took place at some point. Richard's talked about it a few times. And so I know that example. It's like, great, well, that decision didn't go well, did it? Like, no, it didn't. And like, okay, great, well, let's dissect that decision together. And then let's look at some decisions at the next level that did go well. And at the end of the day, they're like, wow, these decisions all have the same core things going on, whether they worked or didn't work. It's like, right, well, that's a decision-making model in the background. So that's how we teach them decision-making, is actually going through real decisions that have happened in your organization. So the end of that, then people will say to you, wow, this felt like this program was made in-house, like for us, by us. And yet you didn't build everything from scratch. You use off-the-shelf things with examples that you found from within your own organization. When we think about a process and how we're going to start a process, our first thought from a leadership development perspective is not how many leaders are there, where are they, what do they want to learn? Our first thought is, why are you doing leadership development? Like, this isn't about delivering training sessions, right? We're not scoring ourselves on the number of times that people attend things. It's about developing leaders. So how do you know it's going to work? What will be different in your company? What KPIs are you going to see? And you really should expect about a 2-to-1 return of investment in your leadership development. So I want to know, what are behaviors doing that you don't like? What are leaders doing right now that you don't like? What behaviors do you want to see more of? How is things going in your customer service and your CSAT scores overall? What's your retention rate like for key employees? What is your engagement? What are your engagement numbers? We want to look at all those because those are our ROI numbers. If we're not moving the needle on those things, then how do we know that all this money that we're putting into developing these leaders and the time that they're investing, how do we know it's even working? So we always start with that first and get a really clear idea of what success is going to look like. In the restaurant example, it was really interesting because we were in a strategy experience, and the two VPs of operations from the front and back of house, from the kitchen and the front staff, were up at the front presenting the strategy, part of the strategy for growth. And the CEO said to them, "What do you think the biggest impediment to our growth is?" And the two of them looked at each other and turned to him and said, "Every time we open new locations, we take our best people from our existing locations and we move them to the new locations. And we leave our A locations, our top locations, with the B team. And that B team is running the large part of our business that's funding our growth." And they're like, "That's not working." They've been trying to hire managers externally, but the 50% of managers that were hired externally left in 6 months. And it's a massive investment in training. So they said, we can't hire externally. We have a 50-50 chance they're going to make it. And they're just like getting indoctrinated in our culture. All of that is a lot of work. We'd rather be hiring from within. But we need to have like a team ready to take on that restaurant who's going to play at an A level. When their bosses leave to go open these brand new flagship locations, because they keep placing bigger bets and the restaurants kept getting bigger. And as a result of them getting bigger, they needed the A teams in there to support the launches. So they said, if we can't develop leaders internally, we can't grow. And the CEO turned to the CFO and said, he's like, "That's not the answer I expected." And the CFO is like, "Well, it's not capital constraint because we're doing really well and the banks want to give us money." So they said, "Well, how do we fix that?" And that was actually the birth of the leadership development program. And that has become, now it's a 4-year program. There's 6 sessions a year over 4 years. There's hundreds of leaders every year. It's like 250 leaders a year that are going through that program. And now when a job is posted, they have the opportunity to apply for that job depending on how many years they've completed of the university, the leadership university. So we knew going in, the goal was grow the company. We have to have leaders ready to take on big responsibility internally to be able to add more restaurants. And that's actually been able to support their growth as they've continued to grow. Now, obviously that's stalled over the last year, as we all know what's happened to restaurants across North America. So once we have the outcomes and the ROI, we want to do a needs assessment. And what the needs assessment is really surveying focus groups and interviews in your organization to understand needs versus wants. So, the directors say, it's directors, right? They'll say, we want to be more strategic. We want to be, we want to be able to deal with complex negotiations. And they have all these thoughts of these high level competencies they want to grow. But then we talk to their managers. And we say to the managers, like, what would you like to see from your director? And like, I would like to get better performance feedback. I would like to get regular feedback. I would like to learn how to deal with difficult conversations from my team. I would like them to give me more autonomy, but not just abdicate, delegate, still be there for me. So the interesting thing is that leaders always have this thing that they think they need. And then the people around them have a viewpoint of what they need. So the VPs say the directors need to get better at this. The managers say, I want my boss to get better at these things. And the directors are saying, I want to learn these things. So the needs assessment for us is to try to figure that all out and then design a program which tackles the actual needs of the organization in terms of what other leaders need from those leaders and their direct reports. and at the same time, make people feel like, well, you still heard us though. Like there's still the stuff that we wanted to have in the program is included in the program. So that's the next step. Usually through that process, we're then building a leadership model. And the reason you have a leadership model is it says, we've got values for our overall organization, but we also want to be super clear on how are we holding leaders responsible for being leaders? Like, what does that actually look like to be a great leader at our organization? The leadership model is a simple framework for people to follow that's connected to the core values of your organization that shows you this is what it looks like to be great here. We just finished one for a major airport here in North America and did a deep dive into their engagement scores. We did interviews and focus groups, surveys, took all this information together and then came back to them and said, you've got a new strategy, you're reorganizing your airport, you're getting ready for the thought that you're about to be able to get international travelers on a bigger level. And here is the leadership model that will match with that. And then once you have that built, then the next step is to say, okay, well, what leadership development is actually going to support leaders in the most efficient and effective way to grow them, to be able to deliver on those leadership behaviors in the leadership model. So what is the approach that we need to take to accomplish that? Every organization we work with has constraints. It's a budget constraint, it's a time constraint, it's a business cycle constraint, like retailers, for instance, right? They've all these zones. We can't do anything between like October 15th and January 15th, right? We've got, we're busy again at Valentine's Day, we're busy. So there's all these times a year we can't do the development. We've got people spread out across North America. We have people in different languages as well. We have people that are comfortable with technology, people that are not as comfortable as technology. That's gone a little bit more by the wayside as a result of COVID and people's, using Zoom for fun things and getting used to it. We have different time zones to deal with. So all of these different things are constraints that we work within to try to design, what is the most effective and efficient way to accomplish that. And really at the beginning, there's always the same kind of 7 things that come up. And so I'm going to put these in the chat window because I'm going to put these in the chat window just so you can read them here too. So these are the top 7 things. If you've never done a leadership development program before and you had to start from scratch and you were to say to me, Mike, we've never done this before. Before I do a needs assessment, before I do anything else, can you just tell me like, what are the top 7, right? These are the top 7 things that pretty much every program that we have done for a client, by the time we're done the needs assessment, these 7 things come up every time. And they are emotional intelligence. And the best way to think about that is the concrete foundation over which you build all your leadership behaviors. If you can't build strong emotional intelligence, all the other things you try as a leader are not going to be as good. As if you have strong self-awareness, strong empathy, motivation, self-regulation, and social skills. It makes a huge difference. Communication, and that communication is just not presenting, but it's also the ability to listen and the ability for you to have other people believe that you're listening to them. Leading by example, giving and receiving feedback, performance-based leadership, which is basically understanding the performance level of the individual that reports to me and being able to use 4 different flexible leadership styles. So in other words, most people have a default leadership style and they just use it all the time and definitely under stress. And what we need to teach them is, yeah, you have a default, but there's other leadership styles and we want to teach you them so that you can use different styles depending on the developmental level of the person that you're working with. Coaching, so we call it developing others through coaching, but the act of coaching versus problem solving. This is a huge challenge for leaders. Most leaders would consider that if somebody came into their office with a problem and they solved it for them quickly, that was a job well done. We had an hour-long meeting. I solved your problem in 10 minutes. Like we both got 50 minutes back. Like how I'm rocking as a leader today. And the reality is that the person leaves with a solution and just as disabled as when they came in the room. They don't have any increase in competency as a result of us solving the problem for them. What coaching is about teaching the difference between problem solving and helping that other person learn how to solve a problem like this, and then guide them through multiple conversations in solving that problem. And as a result, we raise their competency level. So coaching is a critical skill for leaders. And then the last, and it has been highlighted, and as we've come up in this conversation, we talked about socializing in the onboarding piece just before I got started, is creating high performance teams. And the foundational level of creating a high performance team is, if you don't have trust, you can't really build anything on top of that. That's really the foundational piece, is trust. So those are the 7 core topics. There's variability, we might add or take a topic out, but really those 7 come up all the time at the very beginning of a program. And before you get fancy with anything, I would want to make sure people were really good at those things. And then you could build anything on top of that. We cover so much content that it would take us 5 years to actually deliver everything we have to a leader. And so it's a bit of a buffet if you were to think about it from that perspective, but we don't. We think, well, let's figure out what you're going to get the most leverage as an organization of people getting better at. Let's do those things first, get people really good at those things, and then we can get fancy and decide, what the other things we want to add on top. The topics that have been coming up in COVID, more than I saw prior to COVID. So obviously, how to work and lead remotely. That one came up right away. We delivered, I don't know how many sessions and how many thousands of leaders we put through those sessions, but a lot. It was basically that, foundationally, here's what you need to learn to be effective, and what's different about it. Coaching, as I mentioned earlier, coaching became super important because of, again, you're not getting FaceTime with people. People are coming to you with their challenges. Maybe they're just typing it into a Slack message, so it's really easy to just type back the answer. Again, they're not building the competency. Resilience has been big. So if any of you've read the book by Angela Duckworth called Grit, that's a book about resilience. And resilience is really the study of it's when bad things, or what I perceive are bad things, happen to me, how am I able to persevere through? Or I'm working towards achieving something and I keep getting roadblocks thrown at me. How am I able to keep moving forward? And so that's been coming up a lot through COVID. And it might come up in the context of somebody saying, we've got a lot of people that are burning out. And so we're like, okay, their resilience is being tested. So that's where we want to focus. Building trust on teams. Again, as I mentioned, that one's been coming up a lot because people are struggling, particularly on new teams, with new employees being onboarded into organizations. They're struggling to build trust on their teams because you don't have that normal social interaction where kind of like, oh, I've got a daughter, you've got a son, like, oh, they're the same age, that's great. Oh, you went skiing, oh, I'm a snowboarder. Like, that thing that you do in the lunch area, like, that's gone. And so that's how you build trust with people. We build trust at the level of our humanness, who we are as people, not what the role we play in our organizations. Empathy. So empathy has been big. So because everyone's world is different, you may be an introvert and you would be working from home. And right now you realize that being by yourself and working from home, you've been training for this for your whole life as an introvert. If you're an extrovert like me, I don't feel the same about it. I'm like, where are my people? And Zoom does okay for that, but it's a lot more challenging. You've got people that are single at home. You've got people that are in partnership or married at home. You've got people with kids, no kids. You've got people that are in great relationships. You got people at home that are trapped at home with their abuser. You don't know the world view and what's going on for those people as a leader. I know I've got families that we work with where the leaders are saying that both the woman I was speaking to, her and her husband were working from home. They had 4 kids. They had their 2 work laptops. They had an iPad, and their kids now needed to do school all at the same time. They all had homeroom at the same time, 4 different grades, obviously. And they've got one den. And so they're trying to spread people out and share laptops. And so if that's the environment that our leaders are working from, it requires a very different sense of empathy for that family and for what that leader is going through than, say, somebody who's single and working from home and has their laptop and maybe a pet to take care of, and that's about it. And so the level of empathy that's required to understand what's going on in everyone's world is so much higher. And that includes mental health. And that is a very difficult conversation for leaders to be having. And so that's actually touches on the 3 adjacent topics that have really come up a lot. So one being mental health, which is, You know, how do I have conversations appropriately about mental health with the people that work with me? Diversity and inclusion, right? That picked up a lot at the very beginning. It just was in concert with anti-racism. So you've got mental health coming up in COVID, you've got diversity and inclusion, and you've got anti-racism as a result of the highlight that Black Lives Matter put onto the world. And so, you know, these three topics are also getting picked up. We call these adjacent topics to leadership development because they're important to leaders. There are specialists and people who just talk about those topics, and we like to refer them to those people to have those conversations. I want to leave you some book recommendations, and then I want to leave us with a little bit of time to have some questions. So I wanted to share these books that I've read over the last year that I really like. So I mentioned the focus of how important coaching is in your organization. A really good how-to guide that's short, incredibly well-written, very easy to use is a book called The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay-Stanier, and easy to get on Amazon. I mentioned another book by Marshall Goldsmith earlier, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. This is a great book for first-time managers, ones that are moving from being a specialist and an expert in their area to being somebody that is now managing people. For all leaders, I would read the book Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willmix. He is an ex-Navy SEAL commander, and his concept is basically everything that happens in our lives is our responsibility. If his perspective is that anything that happened on the battlefield that went wrong, even though he had another leader drafting the plan, and he wasn't there, anything went wrong, anybody died, it was on him. And that's a level of extreme ownership that if you could imagine all of our leaders and everyone in our organizations no longer being able to point the finger, but instead saying, everything is under my control and I'm going to take extreme ownership for seeing this through, how significantly that could change your culture. Well-written book, great examples. Obviously, because he's a Navy SEAL, they're all sort of based in that area. But he's also gone and done a lot of work speaking to organizations, and so there's a lot of business examples in there as well. And the last one is by Greg McKeown. It's called Essentialism. For me personally, in the last 2 years, it's the best book I've read. It is because one of the challenges of leadership is we'll always have more things than we can get done. Let's face it, we're going to die with a to-do list. So if we're going to die with a to-do list that's long, it really can't be about ticking things off a list. So what essentialism teaches leaders is it teaches leaders a way of actually prioritizing and working on the things that really matter. But that means they need to say no to almost everything that comes in. So they can say a hell yes to the things that really matter. The thing in the middle is called a lukewarm yes. You know it's a lukewarm yes because when it shows up in your calendar, you're like, why did I say yes to this? I don't want to do this. I don't want to go to this. I don't want to talk to this person. I don't even like doing this task, right? That's when you know you probably should have said no. And so essentialism teaches a methodology and a filter for how to get yourself in a hell yes position more of the time. I'd love to leave that we've got about 7 minutes left, I think, here. And so what I'd love to do is open up the floor to questions, both Cameron, to you in the live audience down in Scottsdale, and we could do that live. And then as well on the chat here as well. And then if anybody wants to unmute themselves or raise their hand on the online on Zoom, I'll look for that too. I'm just going to ping you my email address and my website. If you have any questions or you want to circle around with me on anything I talked about today, more than happy to spend the time to chat with you. Just ping me there. And Cameron, I'll turn it over to you, my friend.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I'm glad you actually mentioned Pat Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I've got 5 copies of it here. We're spending the afternoon talking about it. So yeah, it's perfect timing.
Like a mind meld.
Yeah, it's great. So it is one of the classic kind of primers and really good tools to analyze your business on where you sit in leadership. So any questions for Mike right now? We'll start with the in-person people in Scottsdale. Any questions from the group here? Yeah, Jesse?
You mentioned degree or degreed, I wasn't sure what the name of it was. And then so it's taking all of the other training programs and it helps you create like a timeline or, do this one and then this one so that it gives them a little bit of a structure. And would you prefer that, or maybe looking for individual ones within, say, Coursera or Udemy?
Yeah, so imagine what Degree does is it has a subscription to Coursera. I typed it, it's DE, like degreed.com. And what it does is it has a subscription to all the other platforms. So instead of you having to get a LinkedIn subscription, an Udemy subscription, a Coursera subscription, it already subscribes to all of those. And it's gone and actually created course outlines based on pulling courses from each of those different platforms. And then you can go build your own courses if you want to do that as well. So that's what Degree does.
Awesome, thanks. Next question. Yeah.
So on your adult learning model that you talked about, the behavior, habit, attitude, can you give a brief example of how that might play out?
Behavior. Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. So I guess what's probably the best example I can give you? Well, coaching. So just go back to coaching and problem solving. So the behavior that we want them to do is when somebody comes into your office with a problem, we want you to help that person disintegrate or like go deep into that problem to decide, are they talking about a symptom of something greater? So what's the actual root cause of that? That's the first thing you want to do. Whereas our natural proclivity is just go solve the problem. So we want to teach them that behavior. Behavior is, I want you to first figure out what the real problem is and keep digging down. Use the 5 whys and dig down to figure out what the core issue is. Once they have that, then you ask them, you know, who are the people in the organization that need to be involved in helping solve this? Who have you spoken to already? What are your ideas around how you want to research this? Do you have any ideas around what the solution might be? How would you know that you were successful at the end of this? Like if we fix this, what does success actually look like? Because a lot of people haven't even thought that. So they come in and they can tell you what's wrong, but I'm like, well, yeah, I get what's wrong. What does it look like when it's right? And so by coaching them to think about the outcome they're trying to create, it's really hard to move away from something. It's a lot more fun to move towards something positive, right? And so if I get really clear on the outcome that I want, now I can help coach them around the types of resources they need. I can share experiences I've had around solving problems like that. And then that becomes multiple conversations. So from an adult learning perspective, what I've done is I haven't given them the answer. I haven't said like, go read this book. I've said, I'm going to guide you towards figuring out this answer. Now they're building their own competency as a result of doing that. That's what it looks like when a leader is doing that. When we're doing it in the context of leadership development, what we're trying to do is basically say, listen, we want to teach you a series of behaviors. We want you to go practice those behaviors. We want you to come back and meet with a peer. So we get them to meet in between when we see them with somebody that's on their team. Talk about how it went. In terms of practicing that behavior, and then come back and share with us, what was it like to actually try that new behavior out, see how it goes. And so over time, that rinse and repeat of them doing that behavior goes from like, you know, that first time you drove standard and it was like grinding the gears and like stalling on a hill. And then one day you just drove the car and you forgot about the fact you're driving standard. We see that a lot in adult learning, where first it looks really calculated or mechanical. And then eventually they just become fluid. They put their own language around it and it just becomes their new way of being.
Any questions? Thanks, Mike. Any questions from the Zoom attendees? No? Any other questions from the Scottsdale group at all? Mike, I have a question just about how much time should leaders be spending in their leadership development, like over the course of a career? And is there a budget amount that we should be allocating towards growing our people?
Sure. 2 great questions. So I'll answer the first one in terms of time. It needs to be reasonable. I'd say if it's formal learning where they're in a session, they're being coached, they're following up, they're doing prep. We like to keep so let's say they're going to spend half a day in a formal session with their peers a month. That's lots, right? They're going to spend maybe half an hour to 40 minutes prepping for that session. They're going to meet for coffee with somebody that's in their cohort, learning cohort. They might do that for, say, 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes in a month. And if they've got a coaching session, that's going to be an hour. So if you add all that time up, you're talking about like maybe 8 hours in a month on the high side. And that is a completely reasonable request because it's all spread out over a month, right? Completely reasonable request for a leader from a learning perspective in a formal setting. Now, of course, they're going to be reading and they're going to be learning on the job and having conversations that are all part of that learning. But so from a formal perspective, it's that. On the low side, I would say you're probably going to spend 4 hours a month. So 4 to 8 would be the range, I guess. When you think about it from a budget perspective, that really ranges. I mean, an executive, it's not uncommon for an executive to have $25,000 a year spent on their development. Depends on the size of the organization, right? It can be even higher if they're going to a Harvard program or that kind of thing. But let's call it for custom work inside an organization for a leadership team, you're going to be spending somewhere in the range of around 15 to 20 grand per leader on the executive team. For the director level, you're probably going to spend somewhere between 5 and 10. For manager level, you're going to spend between around 2,500. Well, as very low as 1,500, but that's going to require you have a lot of managers because there's an economies of scale when you get to the numbers, larger numbers of leaders, up to around $4,000 per leader. Now, some people might be thinking of those numbers, and you may think, oh, that's quite a bit of money to be spending on leaders. Think about if a key leader leaves, think about the cost of replacing them. The cost of replacing one leader. I don't know, Cameron, if you've ever done the formula for everybody in the room, but if you add up the downtime, the time the hiring a recruiter, the cost of the cost of a recruiter, the time it takes for somebody to be brought up to speed and actually functional in your culture, which is about 6 months. The 6 months that it took you to find them, you're talking about a year. So it's usually at least one-time salary is the cost of the company when you lose a significant star player. And so when you look at that, you think, okay, well, with that money, you could develop that whole team of leaders. And so there's a very, very high ROI to investing those types of numbers in your leaders.
Yeah, and like I always think back to the sports analogy. Like you would never find a pro athlete in any sport that isn't actually practicing and growing their skills, their mindset, their fitness level, their ability 80 to 90% of the time. They're only actually performing in their sport 10% of the time. And in the business world, we kind of have it backwards where we're kind of performing in our jobs 99% of the time, and we think we have to give up time to get better. It goes back to Stephen Covey's, the sharpen the saw, right? That the more time that we grow our skills, the more effective that we're going to be. Like, I think a half a day a month is actually probably even light. I think it's 2 half-day sessions a month is what you want to be doing, pure skill development. And then on top of that, the one-on-one meetings and the growth and the feedback. But there's no college pro painters. And when we were on the top 60 people in the organization, not talking to the franchisees, but the top 60 of us, the 30 GMs and VPs, we were getting a full day of training every single month for the 4 years that I was there. And it was someone come in and train on interviewing, and someone come in and train on meetings. I've had probably 50 hours of training on situational leadership alone. So
I always try to err on this side of caution when I get asked that question, Cameron. I always shoot low because I don't want to scare people off, because I'd rather you just get started and do something and not have this fear of, our people, and honestly, I don't know how many times people have said to me, our culture is different. We're so unique. We're in a unique industry. We have a unique business. And I'm like, I know everybody's a special snowflake. I hear that so much that I'm like, okay, I hear all that, but that's what every client says. So, okay, let's get down to it. Right. It's,
and I think on your dollar side, you've actually given a really big budget, because the reality is if you leverage it properly, like you get a firm like Mike's to come in and train all of your leadership team, it's not costing you $25,000 per person necessarily.
Oh God, no. Yeah.
Right, or you get someone to come in and teach 8 managers about interviewing. You pay them $2,500 for a day's training, and 8 people get skill development. Now, really, that only costs like $400 per person. $300. It's a rounding error.
And that's cut, and we do things that are custom and still keep the numbers low. It's actually, there's so much that versus leaving people to their own devices and having self-directed and then just sort of spending as they want willy-nilly and not really knowing whether or not that's getting you the outcome you want. When you choose to do it internally, there are some pretty significant economies of scale, as you've just described. And it ends up being less than people. I think most people think it costs a lot more than it actually does to do this right.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. We're going to be introducing this group to my Invest in Your Leaders course today because they're the first people to see it.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, we haven't launched it, but I'll send you the link to it today as well, just so you can kind of look at where we are right now. But
amazing.
Thank you so much for showing up and delivering huge value, and to do it while you've got COVID is blowing me away as well. So,
I'm just sitting here self-isolating. What else am I going to do? I'd rather spend time hanging out with all you lovely people than staring at the walls. So no, it's been an honor. I really appreciate you making time for me, Cameron, and for everybody in the room and for everyone online. Thanks for giving me a chance to share with you this thing I am so incredibly passionate about. Enjoy the rest of your conference and have a great day.
Thank you, Mike. We'll get together with your wife and my girlfriend in March for dinner, okay? Because I'll be back.
I look forward to that.
Thanks, Mike. Bye, guys.
See you soon.
Thank you.